Okay, in this video, I'm going to go through some examples of valid and invalid arguments with premises and conclusions that are various combinations of true and false. So in the learning module for Unit 1, Module 2, near the top of the various resources, there's a PDF with this guide in it. So let's just go through and fill in some examples together, and this can be helpful for getting at what's essential to the definition of validity. So let's start with an example of a valid argument that has true premises and a true conclusion. So, premise 1, I have either a cat or a dog. Premise 2, I don't have a dog. Conclusion, what follows if this is a valid argument, because we're putting this in the valid argument category, the conclusion that follows is therefore, I'm going to use these 3 dots to represent therefore, I have a cat. For a moment here, let's not worry about whether these premises and conclusion are true or false, and just see if it makes sense to say that this is valid. What is the definition of validity? My favorite version, there's more than one way to state the definition of validity, but my favorite version is that if the argument is valid, then it's impossible for all of the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Alternatively, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So if it's true that I have either a cat or a dog and I don't have a dog, then I have to have a cat. It's impossible for both of these premises to be true and then the conclusion false. So if that's clear, that is what it means to say that this is a valid argument. Now, this is a case where the premises and conclusion all happen to be true, assuming that I refers to me. It's true that I have either a cat or a dog, and it's true that I don't have a dog, as much as I want one, and it's true that I do have a cat. So this is an example of a valid argument that happens to have true premises and a true conclusion, which means that it's sound, because it's valid and also has true premises. So it has to have a true conclusion as well. But what's really important to understanding validity is that it doesn't really matter to us that these happen to be true, all of 3 of them. This is just a special case of a valid argument. To see what I mean, let's look at one that has false premises and a false conclusion, or at the very least, one false premise. So let's use the same first premise, P1, I have a cat or a dog. Okay, that's true, but let's add something that's false as a premise. Let's say I don't have a cat. Okay, so then what would follow from these 2 premises? If it's true that I have either a cat or a dog and I don't have a cat, then I have to have a dog. If these premises are true, then it must be true that I have a dog. So this is a valid argument. If, emphasis on if, the premises are true, then this conclusion has to be true. If the premises are true, emphasis on if. It's impossible that both of these premises could be true and yet the conclusion could be false. Now, as a matter of fact, premise 1 is true, premise 2 is false, I do have a cat, and the conclusion is false, I don't have a dog, but it's still a valid argument. In the real world, as a matter of fact, these in green here are the truth values of these statements. But I'm not looking for some set of truth values of the statements, I'm looking for a relationship. I want to know if these were true, not are they, but if they were, would this have to be true? And the answer is yes, and that is why it is valid. Let's look at an example of an invalid argument. So let's use this premise 1 again, the same one we've been using, that I have a cat or a dog. This time, let's add the premise, one that happens to be false because this is in the false premises and false conclusion box. Let's add the premise, I do have a dog, that's false. I do have a dog. Conclusion. Therefore, I don't have a cat. Okay, so let's not worry about whether or not these premises and conclusion are actually true or false. Let's just look at the relationship. Is it possible that both premises could be true and yet the conclusion could be false all at the same time? So could it be true that I have either a cat or a dog? So let's say that somebody's calling me with a survey and they say, do you have either a cat or a dog? What they're asking in that survey is, do you have one or the other or possibly both? I'm interpreting or here to mean you could have both and it's still true that you have a cat or a dog. Sometimes we use or exclusively, like when you're out to eat and they say you can have soup or salad. They mean one or the other, not both. But for this example, let's interpret or to mean, do you have a cat or a dog? I'm conducting a survey. Having even one means the answer is yes. Maybe you've got both. The or would still be true. Okay, so assume that it's true that I have one or the other. For the sake of argument, just pretend. And assume I do have a dog. Is it possible that both of these things could be true? Let's put these in circles to suggest like possibility, not actually true. Is it possible that they could be true and yet this could be false? Is this possible? Could I have either a cat or a dog and indeed have a dog, but what would make this false? It would mean that I do have a cat. If this sentence is false, then it would mean I do have a cat. So is it possible that I have one or the other? I do have a dog and also I do have a cat? That's possible. That means it's possible the premises could be true and the conclusion false. This scenario that I described, one where I have both, that would be a counterexample. An example where the premises are true and the conclusion is false, and that proves that this argument is invalid. So this is an example of an invalid argument, and I put it in this bottom box because as a matter of fact, the first premise is true, the second one is false, and the third one is false. So notice, if you look in this box here, this is a case where one premise is true, one is false, and the conclusion is false, but it's valid. This is a case where one is true, one is false, premise-wise, and the conclusion is false. So same truth values for my statements, but this one is valid, and this one is not valid because of the relationship. So let's do a couple more. Let's do an example of an invalid argument that has true premises and a true conclusion. Okay, premise 1. I live in San Diego. Premise 2. San Diego is in California. Conclusion. Therefore, I have a cat. So this is an example where both premises are true. I do live in San Diego, and it's true that San Diego is in California, and it's true that I have a cat. However, the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not good, is not characteristic of a valid argument. Why? Because it's possible that both premises could be true. Let's use circles to be possibly true. It's possible that they could both be true, and yet the conclusion is false. It could be that I live in San Diego, and San Diego is in California, and yet I don't have a cat. That's lots of people, right? So that is why this is an invalid argument. Now the next box down is really easy to come up with examples too. True premises and a false conclusion with a bad argument. That's really easy. Let's just use the same two premises. So here we have an example with two true premises. I do live in San Diego. San Diego is in California. And the conclusion is I have a dog. That's false. But even if we don't look at the truth values of these statements at all, it's clear that this doesn't follow from the two premises in the same way I have a cat didn't follow from the two premises. It just happens to be that I do have a cat and I don't have a dog. And that's true or false, totally independently of the premises that were given in this argument. Both of these would be terrible arguments. One just so happens to have a true conclusion. Okay, the next easiest box that's left is the final invalid argument. So this will be a case where you have two false premises and a true conclusion and no relationship between them. So just make up any two false premises and any true conclusion and you've got an example. So say I made the argument, I live in LA, LA is in Minnesota, therefore I have a cat. Of course, nobody would ever make this argument. It's a stupid argument. But if I intend for these to be reasons to support my conclusion, well, I live in LA, that's false. I live in San Diego. LA is in Minnesota, that's false. It's in California. And I have a cat, it's true. So here's a case where both of the premises are false, the conclusion is true, but it's an invalid argument because it's not the case that if these were true, this would have to be true. It's totally possible that both premises could be true, and yet the conclusion could be false. So a counterexample would be an example in which both premises are true, and yet the conclusion is false. And let's say what that would involve, because in this case it's kind of weird. So that I live in LA isn't hard to imagine. A person could live anywhere, right? So imagine that I live in LA. Now let's imagine that LA is in Minnesota. That's sort of weirder than imagining me living somewhere else, but let's say that LA, maybe not the one in the same LA, but maybe Minnesota also has a city called Los Angeles, and they abbreviate it LA. Imagine that that's true. So is it possible that both of those things could be true, and yet I don't have a cat? Well, I can certainly imagine me living in LA, Minnesota with no cats. That's a logically possible scenario, and that would be a scenario in which both premises are true and the conclusion is false, which proves that this is an invalid argument. It's an invalid argument that just so happens to have two false premises and a true conclusion. Okay, the last box is the one that's the most... Yes, the last box is the one that's most difficult to construct. So I would be surprised if anyone is able to come up with their own version of this, where the other boxes you might have been able to come up with it. But here's an example. Let's let premise 1 be, if I'm in San Diego, then I'm in Minnesota. That's false. And let's let premise 2 be, if I'm in Minnesota, then I'm in California. Clearly false. And what would follow validly from these two premises? If I'm in San Diego, then if I am in San Diego, then I'm in Minnesota. And if I'm in Minnesota, then I'm in California. It follows that if I'm in San Diego, then I'm in California. And the conclusion happens to be true. So this is a false statement, this is a false statement, this is a true statement. This is what the real truth values just so happen to be. However, if both premises were true, this conclusion would have to be true. It's impossible for both of these premises to be true, like if we imagine them as being true, it's impossible for them to both be true and this to be false. It's impossible to construct a counterexample. So there we have examples of valid arguments and invalid arguments whose premises and conclusions are actually true, false, and various combinations. And notice the only thing you can never have is a valid argument with true premises and a false conclusion. So this kind of case, TTTF, of course, you can have more than all of these examples have two premises. You can have arguments with one premise. You can have arguments with 20 premises. But this case where all of the premises are true and the conclusion is false, that can never happen. And let's think of that in terms of our definition. So definition 1 says, if all of the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true, because the one thing that can never happen is this. Another way of putting it is, if the conclusion is false, then one of the premises have to be false. At least one has to be false, because the TF case can never happen. And alternatively, it's impossible for all of the premises to be true and the conclusion false, because that would mean, like, if this was possible, it would be invalid, right? So you can think of validity as, this can never happen, not even in some weird, totally made up sci-fi scenario where we imagine the premises being true. It could never be that if they were true, even if it was a weird sci-fi scenario, if they were true, the conclusion couldn't be false. You could never get this TF case. Okay, so in the remainder of this PDF, there's a similar chart like this for strong arguments versus weak arguments, and you can set up similar kinds of examples for all of those, because what matters is the relationship between the premises and conclusion, not what's actually true or false. And this box, true premises, false conclusion, is possible for a strong argument. So the example that I gave, I think in a couple of places, but one that's really intuitive, is premise. I'm going to give you a series of premises that are all observations. Right? So, my door is open. My window is open. My drawers are all slightly ajar. My computer is missing. Conclusion, I was robbed. Right? So, assume if all of those premises are true, is it possible the conclusion is false? Can you come up with a counterexample? Sure, some weird prank scenario, right? Where it's true, all of those things I just described, those are true, and yet I wasn't robbed, I'm being pranked. So if you can come up with a counterexample that shows it's an invalid argument, but if we are holding it to inductive standards, the question isn't, is it possible that the premises are all true and the conclusion is false? It's, how probable is that? How likely is it that it's a weird prank scenario? And if the counterexample is super weird and unlikely, then the premises provide pretty darn good support for the conclusion. The weirder the counterexample, the more unlikely the counterexample, the stronger the argument. But when it comes to inductive arguments, the defining feature is that the premises make the conclusion probable. So you could have a very, very strong inductive argument, and it's still possible to have true premises and a false conclusion. And so when you think about the extra step, so here we've been talking about the relationship between the premises, which has to do with, so validity is one standard for the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, the guarantee one, and the other is strength. That's something less than a guarantee. And then we also have sound and cogent in the mix. So if you add true premises, you get sound, that's a deductive standard. And if you add true premises to a strong argument, that's a cogent one. So let's imagine that we have a super strong argument. Is it possible? So if the premises are all true, assume for the sake of argument they're all true. If it's a strong argument, is it still possible that the conclusion is false? Yes, this is still possible. Now let's say we find out that indeed all the premises really are true. Well, it's still possible the conclusion is false. So if it's strong, it means that if they're true, this is very unlikely to be false. And if you add cogent, you say, and these really are true. And so for a cogent argument, it means it's very unlikely that this is false, but it still could be. Now, a sound argument could never have a false conclusion, because a valid argument says this can never happen, and a sound argument says that this is the case. All the premises are true. So You could never have a sound argument with a false conclusion. You can have a cogent argument with a false conclusion. Okay, hopefully looking at some examples that really get at how you can have all sorts of combinations of things being actually true or false isn't really what's essential here. It's about what could be true or false and relationships between statements.